Hare Krishna, dear devotees, thank you very much for being with us once again in these weekly videos about the Gita for Everyone program. So today we have the last chapter of the first section of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is divided in 3 sections. Remember that the example that we gave about the first section is the example that Prabhupada gives, the amnesia. Someone, meaning us, have forgotten who we are, what is our occupation, what is our understanding, what is the result that we are looking for. And in this chapter, Krishna will explain how to regain the proper way of thinking. There are many books out there that talk about positive thinking, how to achieve more money, success in different areas. But in reality, the essence of Bhagavad Gita brings out the best in us through spiritual thinking. And this is exactly the topic of our discussion. Before that, the title, chapter 6, it's called Dhyana Yoga. Dhyana basically means meditation. So, in order for us to remember clearly this chapter, let's think about that word, meditation. But what meditation means? In fact, meditation means thinking. It's nothing else than a very focused thinking, very centered, very emphatic thinking on a particular topic, thing, or person. So the word that we want you to remember in this chapter is thinking. We forgot many things, but we essentially forgot our thinking, our spiritual thinking. So let's go through the format that we have used to analyze all these chapters. This is a 47 verses chapter, and Krishna continues. He begins continuing the description of a yogi. In previous chapter, Krishna described the worker in devotion, and sometimes he called that worker in devotion a yogi, because that's the topic from the previous chapters, karma yoga, the one who works in connection with the Supreme. So in this beginning of the chapter, he carries on doing that. And in doing so, he defines what is yoga or renunciation. He defines also the yogi. That's how the chapter begins. Again, giving emphasis on the benefits of those who apply chapter 2, 3, 4, etc. So, as I mentioned, Chapter 6 has 47 verses. It's not too big, and it's quite easy, has an easy flow. And in this chapter, as Prabhupada explains, Krishna will describe the process of the Ashtanga Yoga, or the 8 steps system of yoga. And he will explain actually how one has to sit, how one has to think, how one has to see things outside our body, and also how we can relate to others. What's the vision of the yogi? So this is how Krishna begins and starts developing the topics of this particular chapter, and it ends by Krishna telling us that above the mystic, above the tapasvi, above the yogi, or the highest yogi, is the one who thinks of him, or the bhakti yogi. The content, as we mentioned, the topic is thinking. And in order for us to be more specific, Srila Prabhupada explains in this purport that the focus, the aim, the goal of yoga, it's our mind. So let's say the element or the tool that we use for thinking, it's our mind. One word that we want you to remember is the thinking. And let's say another word that we can add to this, it's our mind. We can say this chapter is the chapter of the mind. Why is this chapter located at the end of the first section? You see, as we mentioned in our previous videos, the purpose of Bhagavad Gita is to help us to think of Krishna. But you see, we only can think of Krishna if the mind is controlled. So Krishna is giving us this chapter in order to teach us how can we control our mind so we can think of him. The topic is thinking, different sections, definition of a yogi, definition of yoga, What are the results of someone who advances in this system of yoga? Very important section, how to control the mind. Arjuna actually rebels against this suggestion of Arjuna practicing yoga. And he says that the mind is harder to control than the wind. So very, very interesting. And also all the symptoms. As I said, it's a kind of a continuation of chapter 5. Let's remember that at the end of chapter 5, Krishna mentions the process of yoga in text 27 and 28 before he finishes. And then he elaborates now in chapter 6 about the yogi and the yogic process. The connection with the previous one, as Krishna always does, he mentions some things in one chapter. In a future chapter, whether in the next or some chapters after that, he will elaborate on that particular topic, whether death or doubts or yoga or karma or certain things. He will elaborate more and more in the future chapters. So that's the connection with the previous chapter, chapter 5. And the connection with the 7th chapter, this is very important. The first thing that Krishna says in the first verse of chapter 7 is, listen from me. Takshrinu. Listen from me, because now I'm going to explain to you about me. That's what's coming. That's the next section. But as I mentioned, we cannot think of Krishna. We cannot meditate, which is the translation of this chapter. We cannot meditate in Krishna. We cannot think of Krishna if our mind is not controlled. So Krishna talks about the renunciation of the different desires of the mind to enjoy the objects. He talks about renunciation, he talks about regulation, all the things that are needed for us to have a proper spiritual way of thinking. That is the way in which Krishna develops this chapter. A few things before we finish. Questions of Arjuna. He presents his questions in text number 37 and 38, where he actually compares, not only presents a question, but he also presents an analogy. He says that what happens, the question is, what happens with someone that takes devotional service or the practice of yoga, and then because of a mundane mentality, he gives up. What happens with that person? And he gives an analogy. Does that person is destroyed, it's ripped apart, just like a riven cloud. He doesn't have any gains materially, because one, in order for us to practice yoga, we have to give up material things. So doesn't he achieve any material results or any spiritual results because he has failed or stopped practicing yoga? That's the question that Arjuna presents in text 37 and 38, and also an analogy there. There are other analogies also that we find there in this chapter. The first one is we found it in text 5 and 6, where Krishna compares the mind to the best friend or the worst enemy, if it's control or not control. The other one is 19, where Krishna compares the mind of a yogi as a lamp in a windless place, so something that cannot be moved. That's the comparison. So these are the three analogies that we find. 5, 6 in 19, and also 38 presented by Arjuna. And Krishna in this particular chapter will answer very clearly what happens when you stop practicing yoga or give up the spiritual process. And in that way, he convinces Arjuna that actually practicing yoga, especially the easiest way of yoga, as he describes it, by thinking of him. That's the last verse. So one word, thinking. One example that we want you to remember, the wind. The mind is just like a flame of a candle or a fire, and there is no wind. So every time you see wind, you think, this is the mind, how it's so chanchalam, or so movable, so hard to control. And one verse, the last verse. You don't have time to read all the verses and all the purpose. At least read that verse, text 47, and the purpose. Thank you very much. We hope that this is useful for your understanding of the Bhagavad Gita as it is by Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.